The Cincinnati winter was merciless. A sharp, unforgiving wind howled through the nearly deserted streets, cutting through layers of fabric and biting into exposed skin. Streetlights flickered against the icy pavement, casting long, ghostly shadows as a few pedestrians hurried past, their heads bowed against the bitter cold. Ethan Caldwell barely noticed the cold. He had only been back from deployment for a few days, trying and failing to adjust to civilian life. Something had been gnawing at his gut, an unease that refused to leave, like a whisper at the back of his mind that he couldn't quite hear but knew was there. Then he saw it. A dog lay curled up near a concrete bench, barely more than a shadow against the frozen sidewalk. At first glance, it looked like any other stray, another forgotten soul lost in the cracks of the city. But something about the way the animal lay there, unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of its ribs, sent a jolt through Ethan's chest. He took a step closer, and the breath left his lungs. The dog's fur, once thick and strong, was now matted with dirt and grime. Its ribs protruded sharply against its thin frame, and its breathing was shallow, labored. Eyes, once filled with sharp intelligence and fierce determination, now stared blankly, dull and lifeless. And then Ethan saw the scar, a jagged, unmistakable mark just above the right eye. His stomach clenched so hard he nearly doubled over. No, it couldn't be. It wasn't possible. But it was. Atlas, his partner, his brother, the dog who had stood beside him through hell and back, who had saved his life more times than he could count, was now nothing more than a broken shell, abandoned to die on a frozen sidewalk. Ethan dropped to his knees, his pulse hammering in his ears. Atlas. His voice barely escaped his lips, rough with disbelief. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a flicker, a slow, barely perceptible shift in those glazed-over eyes. Recognition, faint but there. And then the slightest twitch of a tail, like the last ember of a dying fire struggling to spark back to life. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached out, but Atlas flinched at the touch. That hesitation shattered him. Atlas had never recoiled from him before. Ethan barely had time to process the gut-wrenching moment before a voice cut through the cold night air. "You know this dog?" His head snapped up. Standing a few feet away was an older man, his white hair disheveled, his long black coat buttoned tightly against the chill. He clutched a worn leather leash in one hand, his fingers stiff and pale from the cold. But it wasn't the weather that made his eyes darken. It was something else. Something heavier. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "He was my partner," he said, his voice raw. "My brother in war." The old man let out a long, shaky breath, his gaze flickering between Ethan and the frail dog lying on the pavement. "Then you need to hear what happened to him, before it's too late." A storm raged inside Ethan. Too late? No, it wasn't too late. It couldn't be. He looked back at Atlas, at the once mighty warrior now reduced to a shivering, starving shadow of himself. His gut twisted. "Tell me," he demanded. The man hesitated, shifting his weight as if trying to decide whether to say the words at all. Then, with a sigh, he spoke. "The military sold him." Ethan's breath caught. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had heard correctly. "They? What?" The man nodded grimly. After his last mission, they deemed him unfit for service. No retirement ceremony, no honor. Just a signature on a piece of paper, and he was gone. A slow, burning rage began to rise inside Ethan. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He had seen men come back broken, thrown aside like disposable tools. But Atlas, the dog who had given everything, who had saved lives? His voice was a whisper, deadly calm. "Who bought him?" The man exhaled, rubbing his hands together, his gaze lowering. "A private security firm, Baldwin Security. But they didn't take care of him. They worked him to the bone, pushed him past his limits, and when he couldn't perform anymore." He hesitated, then met Ethan's gaze. "They dumped him, just like the military did." Ethan felt his blood turn to ice. Atlas had been betrayed, not once, twice. His pulse pounded in his ears. Someone was going to pay for this. Ethan's world turned red. His jaw tightened, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned white. His breath came in slow, measured inhales, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had faced battlefields drenched in fire, seen men break under pressure, but nothing had prepared him for this level of betrayal. Atlas had given everything. He had charged into gunfire, dragged wounded soldiers to safety, taken hits meant for men who now walked free. He had served with loyalty that never wavered, Not even once. And in return, they had discarded him like garbage. Ethan's pulse hammered against his temples as he turned back to the old man, his voice a low growl. How long? The man shifted uneasily. Not long, maybe a week. He hesitated, then sighed. But he wasn't much better before that. Ethan's breath hitched, his eyes, dark with fury, locked onto the man's. Not much better? His voice was cold, razor sharp. What does that mean? The man looked away. His fingers tightened around the leash, his knuckles pale. They overworked him, starved him, treated him like a machine. And when he finally broke down, they threw him out, left him here to die alone. Something inside Ethan snapped. His gut twisted violently, rage mixing with something deeper, guilt. He had left Atlas behind, believing the system would do right by him, believing his partner would get the retirement he deserved. He had been a fool. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with pure, unfiltered rage. Their mistake, he said, his voice eerily calm, deadly, was thinking no one would come for him. Atlas whimpered softly beneath him, the frail sound cutting through Ethan's fury like a blade. He dropped to one knee, his hands moving instinctively to the dog's matted fur. Atlas flinched but didn't pull away completely. Ethan exhaled sharply. He had already lost too much in war. He wasn't losing Atlas. He glanced up at the old man, his eyes burning. Who let this happen? The man hesitated. You're not gonna like the answer, son. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Tell me? The old man sighed, his breath visible in the freezing air. The same people who trained him. Ethan's heart pounded. The military, the country they both served. And suddenly, he knew this wasn't just about Atlas anymore. Ethan didn't waste another second. He scooped Atlas into his arms, the once powerful dog now nothing more than skin and bones. His body was frighteningly light, a stark contrast to the muscular warrior he had once been. The weight of him, both literal and emotional, hit Ethan like a freight train, but he pushed it down. There was no time for anger, no time for guilt, only time to act. The cold wind bit at his face as he sprinted down the empty streets, his boots pounding against the frozen pavement. Every labored breath Atlas took sent a spike of urgency through his chest. He could feel the dog trembling in his arms, his shallow breathing uneven, his ribs barely rising with each fragile inhale. Hold on, buddy, Ethan muttered, his voice raw with desperation. I got you. His eyes darted around, scanning the deserted blocks ahead. There had to be a vet nearby. Somewhere. Anywhere. He couldn't let Atlas slip away, not like this. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A red neon glow flickered against the dark sky. 24-hour emergency vet clinic. Ethan didn't slow down. He crashed through the glass doors, kicking them open with his boot. The startled receptionist barely had time to react before Ethan's voice thundered through the small waiting room. I need help, now! A woman in blue scrubs rushed forward, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the soldier standing before her, his uniform damp with sweat, his arms wrapped protectively around a half-dead German shepherd. Oh my God, she whispered. Then she snapped into action. Get him to the back, now! Two vet techs rushed over, gently taking Atlas from Ethan's grip. The moment they lifted him away, Ethan felt his chest tighten with an unbearable emptiness. Atlas didn't even struggle, didn't react, didn't fight, and that, more than anything, terrified him. Ethan moved to follow, but a firm hand pressed against his chest. Sir, let us work, the vet said firmly. Ethan didn't argue. He just stood there, fists clenched, jaw locked, his pulse hammering in his ears as Atlas disappeared behind a set of double doors. Then, silence. A silence more deafening than any battlefield Ethan had ever known. Ethan sat in the sterile waiting room, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers interlocked so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The air smelled of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights above only amplifying the unbearable stillness. His mind raced in circles, replaying the image of Atlas being carried away, his limp body, the way his ribs barely moved with each breath. The dog who had once been unstoppable now hung on by a thread. He needed to focus. Sitting here, drowning in guilt and rage, wouldn't help Atlas. But finding out who had done this to him, that was something he could control. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened a search. Baldwin Security. The company's website loaded instantly, a sleek professional page boasting of elite private protection services. Images of men in tactical gear filled the screen, standing beside black SUVs and armored vehicles. Patriotic slogans were scattered throughout, painting them as defenders of corporate executives and high-profile clients. But Ethan wasn't fooled. This wasn't a security firm. This was something much darker. He dug deeper, scanning military forums and watchdog sites. His jaw clenched when he found what he was looking for. A hidden post buried in an old discussion thread. Baldwin Security is buying up retired canines. No oversight. No medical care. They work them into the ground, and when they break, they dump them. Some end up on the black market. Some just disappear. Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. Atlas wasn't the only one. There were others. A notification popped up. Luke Donovan, his old intelligence contact. Ethan hadn't spoken to him in years, but this wasn't the time for hesitation. He tapped the call button, his pulse steady despite the fury boiling beneath the surface. The line rang once, twice, then a voice. Caldwell? A pause. Damn, it's been a long time. What's going on? Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing his voice to remain level. I need information on Baldwin Security. Everything you can get me. There was silence on the other end. Then Luke sighed. Jesus, what the hell did they do? Ethan's eyes flickered toward the closed doors where Atlas was fighting for his life. They took my partner, he said, his voice like steel. And now they're going to pay. Ethan gripped his phone so tightly it felt like it might crack under the pressure. The weight of Luke's silence on the other end of the call was heavy, filled with unspoken understanding. Caldwell, Luke finally said, his voice low. If you're asking about Baldwin Security, you're not looking for justice. You're looking for war. Ethan didn't blink. Then I guess I'm going to war. He heard Luke exhale, a slow, measured breath. All right, he muttered. Give me an hour. The call disconnected, leaving Ethan alone with the storm brewing inside him. He tucked his phone away and leaned back against the stiff plastic chair, his eyes fixed on the door that separated him from Atlas. The vet had said it would be a long road to recovery. If Atlas even survived. The thought ignited something dark in his chest. Atlas had done everything right. He had served, obeyed, fought, bled. He had never faltered, never hesitated. And when the military was done with him, when he could no longer serve, they had sold him. Not retired him, not honored him, sold him. Like he was nothing more than a piece of surplus equipment. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had always known the system wasn't perfect. But this was betrayal. The door to the waiting room swung open, and Dr. Lillian Carter stepped out. She met Ethan's gaze, her expression unreadable as she pulled off her surgical gloves. He's stable, for now. The relief was brief, a flicker before reality crashed back in. What's the damage? Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. Dr. Carter sighed. Malnourished, severely dehydrated, multiple untreated injuries. But what's worse? She hesitated, then continued, there are signs of abuse. Ethan inhaled sharply through his nose, forcing himself to stay seated, his hands curled into fists, his nails digging into his palms. He needs time, care, she added. But most of all, he needs you. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. He's got me. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. Baldwin Security thought they could get away with this. They were wrong. The next time Ethan stepped onto a battlefield, it wouldn't be in uniform. It would be personal. Ethan sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The engine hummed beneath him, a steady vibration that barely cut through the storm raging inside his chest. The world outside was dark, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror as he drove toward something he knew he couldn't walk away from. His phone buzzed beside him. A message from Luke. Coordinates, a location, a target. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring at the glowing screen. Baldwin Security's off-the-books facility, the place where they had worked Atlas to the bone, where they had broken him. And if Luke was right, it wasn't just Atlas. There were others. He clenched his jaw, his mind already calculating. The facility was off-grid, far enough outside the city that no one would hear anything they didn't want heard. A perfect place to hide something, or someone. His gut told him this wasn't just a security company cutting corners. This was something worse. The thought made his blood burn. Atlas had fought for them, had saved lives, and in return, they had treated him like a disposable weapon, used him until there was nothing left, then tossed him aside like trash. Ethan had seen men do the same to soldiers, leaders who saw their people as assets, not brothers. And he had seen what happened when those men were never held accountable. Not this time. His fingers hovered over his phone screen. He scrolled through old contacts, names he hadn't spoken to in years, names of men who had been used up and cast aside just like Atlas. Men who would want justice. A part of him knew what this meant. Once he crossed this line, there was no coming back. But when he looked over at the empty seat beside him, the spot where Atlas should have been, he knew he had already crossed it the moment he saw his partner dying in the street. His thumb pressed down. A call connected, a voice on the other end. Caldwell. Ethan's pulse was steady. I need backup. A pause. Then a slow exhale. Tell me when and where. Ethan put the truck in gear, his jaw set. This wasn't just a fight. This was war. Ethan drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound cutting through the cold night. The world outside was nothing but an endless stretch of dark highway, but his mind was locked on one thing. Holloway. The man who had orchestrated all of this. The man who had turned loyal war dogs into disposable weapons. The man who had left Atlas to rot in the street. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Luke. Confirmed, Holloway is on site. High security. Be ready. Ethan exhaled slowly. He was ready. He had been ready since the moment he saw Atlas lying on that frozen sidewalk, broken and alone. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. As he neared the compound, he killed the headlights and pulled off onto a dirt road, parking a safe distance away. Through the trees, he could see the facility, a sprawling, heavily guarded complex, surrounded by floodlights and barbed wire. It looked like a military base, but there was no flag, no insignia, just cold concrete and steel, hiding the horrors inside. He grabbed his gear and stepped out into the night, moving like a ghost through the underbrush. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the kind of focus he had learned on the battlefield. This was just another mission. Only this time, it was personal. Reaching the perimeter, he spotted the weak point Luke had marked, a blind spot in the patrol pattern. He waited, timed it, then moved, silent, precise, deadly. Slipping inside, he pressed his back against the cold steel of a storage building, scanning the area. Guards, cameras, armed men patrolling like they were expecting trouble. Good, because trouble had arrived. He moved quickly, taking down a lone guard with practiced efficiency. A flash drive in the man's pocket caught his attention. Ethan took it. Whatever was on here, it was important. Then a voice. You should have stayed gone. Caldwell. Ethan turned slowly. Holloway. The older man stood a few feet away, flanked by two armed guards. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something close to amusement. Ethan's grip tightened around his weapon. I don't run, he said, his voice like steel. Not from men like you. Holloway smirked. Then I guess this is where it ends. Ethan exhaled. No, he said, this is where it begins. Atlas was more than just a dog. He was a soldier, a protector, a hero. Yet when he could no longer serve, the very system he had fought for abandoned him. His story is not unique. Countless military and working dogs give everything they have, only to be discarded like broken tools when they are no longer useful. But they are not equipment. They are living beings, loyal companions, and warriors who deserve dignity, respect, and care. This story is a wake-up call. It's a reminder that loyalty should never be a one-way street. These animals devote their lives to us, risking everything. Yet too often, they are left to suffer once their job is done. We cannot allow that to continue. If we call ourselves protectors, if we claim to honor those who serve, then we must stand for them even after their service ends. We must advocate for stricter protections, better adoption programs, and proper retirement for working animals. Most importantly, we must remember that true heroes don't just wear uniforms, they also walk on four legs. If this story moved you, let it be a call to action. Support rescue organizations, speak up for retired service animals, and above all, never turn your back on those who would never turn their back on you.